Hello, it's already week 7 of our textiles course in the interior design department. Did I say week 7? It's actually week 9, in case I just said 7. Nice to have you in class today, even though you're not in person in class today. Nice to see you. For me, it's a beautiful winter morning, but I'm not sure when you're actually going to be watching this recording. So our lecture today is going to be on color application, also dyeing and printing. And I'm assuming that at this point, most of you have already taken the color theory course as part of your interior design program. But we will be reviewing some of the aspects of color theory today in our class. So I will not be taking attendance, and you cannot put in chat what your favorite color is, but just think kind of to yourself or say it out loud what your favorite color is and what you love about that color. I love greens, I love blues, I love reds. I would say greens are probably my favorite. The colors that you see in nature, I guess, would be my favorites. So go ahead and say out loud what your favorite color is. You watched a couple of videos this week, and it's interesting. These two videos, everybody's always able to view the second one, but for some reason, about half my students are not able to review the second video, which I'm not quite sure why. That's so odd that some of you can and some of you cannot. But the first video on eco-friendly dyeing kind of gave you a bit of an overview of dyeing fabric from the point of view of a t-shirt fabric dyeing company in California called Bella Plus Canvas. And I know that one of my students in my class last year actually had some t-shirts and sweatshirts from this company and confirmed that it is a very good company and that their t-shirts and sweatshirts, their t-shirts in particular, do not twist. And after they're washed, the side seams still line up and the shirts do not shrink. So the method that they used with their special $1 million machine, as we were told about in the video, apparently does work. So the video reviewed color development, how the dye colors are digitized. They showed you a little bit of a hint of what screen printing looks like, and we'll see another video on that later on in the class. They talked about the quality of dyes that they use and how dyes can be bad for the environment. They only use ones that are Blue Design approved, which is a watchdog Blue Design company. They talked about getting the right color consistency in their dyes, and of course, spent a lot of time about the pre-shrinking of their t-shirts and using that $1 million machine that helps fabric avoid both the shrinking and the twisting. They talked about having to meet up with the California air quality standards, how the energy from the drying fabric, the steam that's actually used to dry the fabric, can be recycled and reused in another way. So some good concepts from that video. The second video, which some of you, hopefully all of you, are able to view now, talked about rotary printing on fabric. Wasn't a great video, didn't have any narrative, but it showed how fabric goes through several rollers to add the various colors. It's also called roller printing. That's what I hear it called more often than rotary printing. And it's a tricky device. We're going to see another, these machines are quite tricky. We're going to see another video on this later on in the class. And the question always comes up is, how, they're adding all these different layers of colors, and how do the previous colors not smudge? And I don't have an answer for that. I've watched this video a couple of times, and it seems like they're almost simultaneously adding the various colors, but you would think that they would have to dry between the different layers. So I'm going to have to do some more research on that to answer some students' questions on that. As I mentioned, we're going to talk just a bit about color application before we go on to talk about dyeing and printing. And color is just so much fun. It's one of the things that I probably appreciate most in this world. I appreciate how our Father and Mother in heaven created this beautiful color wheel that is kind of magical when you start studying color theory and see how colors play off of each other. And all of this concept that we use in color theory comes from the colors of a prism or the colors that we see in a rainbow in nature. But you certainly have learned in color theory courses how complementary colors play off of each other, the colors that are directly across from each other on the color wheel look better when they're put with their complement, then they look better with their complement than they do by themselves. They complement each other. So your reds and greens complement each other, your blues and oranges, your yellows and purples. And then if you look at the colors between, say, the yellow and green, which is a yellow-green, how well it looks in with a red-violet, which is right between the red and the purple on your color wheel. So a lot of magical things happen when we study the color wheel. We always find, or I always find, complementary colors in nature. I love to hike, and if I see a yellow flower, I know I'm going to see something purple nearby. If I see a lot of green, there's inevitably red nearby. That those colors complement each other. The blues and the oranges are a little bit harder to find in nature, but I inevitably find them. They are there. If I find blue flowers, it's not going to be too hard to look and find orange ones in the same area. There are so many complementary colors that we can find in nature. So a little bit of an introduction to the lecture today on dyeing and printing. So we'll start by talking about dyeing, how fabric, yarn, or the fibers themselves are immersed in and saturated with a solution that completely colors that particular material. That's the dyeing process in a nutshell. The printing process is where coloring agents are applied to specific areas of the pattern to create patterns or motifs. So we'll be talking about how color can be imparted into fabric in today's lecture. But before we do that, let's just look at another color wheel, because I find color wheels so fascinating. You're familiar with the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, that create a triangle. We also have the tertiary colors, which are green, orange, and purple. Those three look great together. And then also, of course, the primary colors just are complement each other in really quite magical ways, as I mentioned earlier. I just love playing with a color wheel and using that as it translates into the interior design world, or into the clothing world, or into the fabric world in any way. The understanding of the color wheel is an incredibly important thing for you as an interior designer. I agree with what she has to say on colors, but I think she makes some very, very good points. I know when I started out studying interior design back in the, oh my gosh, it must have been 1970, late 1970s, let's just say that, 1978, 1979. And I had to make my first color boards for a class at Brigham Young University. I used very saturated colors. All my colors were overly saturated, which is what she was talking about. And I remember my instructor telling me about bridge colors and how I need to lighten things up a little bit and have a place for the eye to rest, because everything was so heavily saturated. That's what she was showing both in the red and black combination, and also the turquoise and brown. She talked about, not only did she talk about oversaturation and needing a bridge color, a neutral, a white, or something to kind of act as a bridge. Also, she talked about letting one color dominate over the other, and then also adding a pattern, which I think were all very, very good ideas. And what I took, and what I thought was the most interesting, when she talked about the turquoise and brown combinations. Turquoise is a form of green blue, and she talked about these reddish toned woods complementing those green toned colors. Of course, those are complementary colors, and we have to remember that when we introduce wood generally has a tone to it, and whether it's a yellow tone or a red tone, you're going to find that that's going to complement the color that it is opposite from on the color wheel. And we saw that used very successfully in some of the rooms that she showed with turquoise and brown. And then in the brown and beige combination, I really loved what she said about comparing it to looking at a stone in nature. I mean, you can just pick up one little rock and see that it's going to have just dozens and dozens of colors in it, and textures in it. And I think that was the idea that she wanted to make with the brown and beige rooms, that they should be very, very multicolored, with lots of variations in the texture, and working quite well with those neutrals. So some good points from that. Okay, so a little bit more talking about color before going on to dyeing and printing. We've talked about color fastness and color matching, which are not really shown too well on this particular slide. but we have to make sure that the colors that we use are resistant to crocking, which is that physical rubbing that we talked about before, that in wet and dry conditions. We need to make sure it's going to hold up to light, how well the fabric's going to hold up to bright light, and we'll watch a brief video on that in just a minute. So things that you need to pay attention to. There are machines that have small isolated chambers that you can put fabric in to see how well it holds up to different light conditions and how it looks in different light conditions. And we'll watch a video on that in just a minute and see how different fabric can look in under a variety of light conditions. This gets to be a little bit technical here, but when you might submit a sample for a factory to use to match a color to, that fabric is, that sample is lab dipped to see how close the color is to the target. So you will be asked as the customer to review the lab dip and to sign off on it and see if the color actually matches the sample that you brought in, if you're ordering something for a custom job, which is usually not the case, but that is something that is available to tell fabric's going to look under different lights. But as we've talked about in class before, the best thing to do is actually to take that fabric and see how the color looks in the room that it's going to be in different lights, different time of the day, with interior lights on and off, with curtains open and natural light coming in, or how it's going to look at night. That's the only way you're really going to see how your fabrics and the colors are going to play off of each other, is by looking at them in the actual environment in which they're going to be used. Okay, so back to a few things that we need to pay attention to in color. Fabric color is never permanent, as this slide says, but relative color performance is important for some uses and is measured and compared in several ways. We need to see a color's light fastness, how well it holds up to its original color when it's subjected to light. And I've talked a few times in this class about my red silk curtains that are not holding up well to light. They're fading, certainly. We've talked about crocking, which is the physical rubbing of the fabric surface, how its resistance or fastness is measured in both wet and dry conditions. We want to make sure that that color stays on the fabric, it doesn't transfer to other fabrics. And gas fading is something we have not talked about, and that's referred to as a change of color because of impurities in the air, or if it's in clothing, that can be a physical condition. Underarm sweat would be a gas fading condition where the color actually changes due to chemicals in your body. So back to printing and dyeing on the left side of this slide. First, dyeing, which is what we're going to talk about first. The fabric, the yarn, or the fiber itself can be saturated with a solution that completely colors that particular material, be it the fabric, the yarn, or the fiber. Whereas printing is where coloring agents are going to actually be applied to specific areas of the fabric surface to create patterns or motifs. Okay, so basically we have fabric in two categories. Components that are colored before the fabric is produced. They can be yarn dyed, stock dyed, or solution dyed, and we're going to go over all those terms in just a minute. We start with fabric that is the grayish, which is just your natural unprinted fabric that we start with, and that has color applied to it, which could be the printing process or piece dyed. So dye, talking about dyes just a little bit, and then we'll go on to the specific types of dyeing. A dye is a chemical that creates a specific color when it bonds to a particular material. Dyes vary in vulnerability to light, exposure, washing, and other uses depending on the dye's chemical makeup and on the material that it is applied to. And not all dyes can dye all fabrics or fibers. So the companies that are dyeing these fabrics already know which types of dyes to use with which types of fabrics. We'll now cover a few types of dyeing. 5 in particular. We're going to talk about fiber dyeing. First of all, where the actual fibers, remember fibers from our early class, the fibers from the silk, the fibers from the cotton, linen, the wool fibers. So sometimes fabric is dyed way back in the when it's still just a fiber, before that fiber has been made into a yarn or a thread, before that yarn or a thread has been woven or knit into fabric. So sometimes the fibers themselves are dyed. Sometimes there is what's called solution dyeing. We'll learn about that in just a minute. That's generally on synthetic fabrics. Sometimes the yarn is dyed, and this slide hints at that just a bit. We also have piece dyeing and resist dyeing. Here, or one of these dyeing methods, right view, something that looks like this. See how the weave on these is a little bit complicated, but the dye is added, and the different fibers kind of attract the dye in different ways. So we have cross-dyed fabrics that contain two different fibers, and they're dyed two different colors after they are woven. So the dye baths target the two different fibers, and the dyes respond differently to the two different fibers that are woven together in the fabric. So you get this look of kind of two different colors that magically appear because the dye adheres differently to the two different kinds of fibers. These dyeing methods mentioned here. So it's kind of a good exercise to pick up some articles of some things around you and see if you can figure that out. Resist dyeing. Okay, we looked at yarn dyed samples. All right, we've talked to, okay, now to talk a little bit about pigments. Pigments are not actually dyes, but they are, put this right here so I don't forget to use that in a minute, but they are coloring agents that are added on top of the fabric. So they're not physically bounded to the surface of the fabric. They are physically bounded to the surface of the fabric, excuse me, but they're not chemically bound with the fiber. So in other words, they just kind of sit on top of the fiber, and you can almost, sometimes if they're not bonded very well, you could almost scratch them off. So pigments are different than dyes in that they sit on top of a fabric, and you can see an image of that in the top left of your screen. They don't usually color an entire cloth, but rather are applied to fabrics only through just a random print method. They're inexpensive, they're opaque, and they basically sit on top of the fabric. They make it kind of hard and stiff, but those would be pigments as opposed to that. So can you find something that was done in your room with direct roller printing, also called rotary printing, where each of the rollers applies something in a different color? That might be the case for the scarf that I'm wearing. Could have been done with direct roller printing on this silk, where each of the rollers added one of the different colored fabrics. Discharge printing, where some areas were blocked by paste or wax to avoid those areas being printed. Screen printing using the silk fabric with a squeegee running over it. Burned out printing, where chemicals were used to kind of burn away. Acid is used to burn away certain parts of it. The heat transfer printing is going to be the most easy one for you to find in your room. A t-shirt with a design on it, a sweatshirt with a school logo on it was probably done with a heat transfer printing device, or a digital printing, perhaps on a very, very busy fleece comforter that you have in your room. The color might have been printed on that using a digital printing method, perhaps. All right, let's wrap this up by the technology of, actually, it appears that I may not have uploaded this video for you, unfortunately, or downloaded this video for you to watch. So we're not going to be able to see this particular video that shows some of the printing methods, most of which you already reviewed in the video that you watched earlier. Okay, so we'll just talk about some of these printing methods. This shows roller printing, which is also called rotary printing. We talked about earlier how each of these different rolls applies different colors that make up these wonderful printed fabrics, which is very, very different than a dye method where the dye is added beforehand. Now we're printing onto the surface of the fabric. So a copper roller is engraven to match the desired textile design. The roller is wider than the fabric. Multicolor designs require individual rollers for each color. And then each roller is positioned against a large drum on the printing machine, and the unprinted fabric is fed between these rollers and the drum. The color box containing one color of dye paste is located between each roller, and the color is delivered by the roller onto the fabric. So this is, I just don't understand how this is done, whether or not the colors dry between each roller applying a different color, or how that works out so that it doesn't smudge. It's really kind of a question that I have. But let's look at a couple of fabric samples in our book that are done with this method, starting with number 75 in your books. If you will turn to that. This one's actually a vinyl wall covering, and you can see on the die print method that it was the roller method used to achieve this particular look. And the roller, we would have started out with a basic beige fabric, and then these different colors would have been added by different rollers using this particular roller method. Turn to number 81 as well for another example of that. That's a muslin fabric, and a white paint was added to create this print using a roller method, which is what you wrote in the die print method. So a couple examples in our book that show the roller method. Screen printing was also reviewed a little bit on the video that you watched. Screen printing, you use a fine woven mesh. When I've done it before, we used silk mounted on a frame, and then certain portions of the screen surface are blocked with an enamel-like covering, which creates a stencil on the screen itself. And then the color is poured onto the frame and brought across the fabric with a squeegee, and the areas that have been enameled do not allow the paste or the paint to pass through. So different areas are blocked with this enamel, and then that kind of creates a screen printed fabric. We have one sample of that, 49 in your swatch kit. So if you'll turn to that, please, number 49. You can see that the die print method on 49 is a screen print method, certainly not done by hand. It's done in a mechanized way on this toile de jouy ducks, and that is a screen print method, but not done by hand, as you may have seen in the video. So one sample of a screen print that is done in a mechanized way, just letting different colors come through with the screen, an enamel-like component put on the screen to prevent color going onto different parts of it. Heat transfer printing, some of you may have done that, where you buy transfers and iron them onto a t-shirt or a different fabric. That's the most simplified version of a heat transfer printing method. So in a more mechanized way, the design is printed onto paper or fabric using the links that contain dispersed dyes. The face of the paper is pressed against the fabric through a transfer machine, and then high temperatures and pressure allow that the dye subliments to transfer onto the fabric. So special orders of this would certainly require large orders in order to make it economically viable, but it is very fast to print once it's all set up. So if you have played with heat transfers yourself, it's kind of a fun thing to do just with a t-shirt and an iron. And I would guess that about several of you watching this video, in fact, the class that I taught on this earlier this week, a class of about 20, probably 10 of the class members had on t-shirts that had been made with this heat transfer printing process. It's a very common thing for t-shirts and sweatshirts to put school logos or other things on your basic t-shirts, and you can actually fill the dyes on top of the t-shirt that have been transferred, and it's not necessarily on your t-shirt. It's going to be something that lasts a long time. Sometimes those transfers will wear off or start to lift in time. but you're familiar with it you can be more familiar with it if you look at a t-shirt right now that has color transferred onto it, probably with this heat transfer printing method. Discharge printing. We have an example of that too on number 66 in our book. If you'll turn to 66. And that's a beautiful, large polka dot, white polka dots on a pink background. So discharge printing, we have a background color, as is shown on this slide, that is kind of a medium to dark color. And they add a substance containing both a bleaching agent and a dye paste applied to the cloth. So we're going to bleach out some areas, and we're going to block some areas from being dyed. Discharge printing can be recognized by their solid color ground. And if you look at the front or the back of this fabric sample, you can see that that dye of that pink is kind of saturated all the way through to the front and the back, as it said in this slide. So custom orders would be expensive and difficult to execute. And then the bleaching agent dye paste looks like dirty bath water as it is applied. So we can see that the bleaching agent would have, on the sample in our book, would have bleached out these big white dots on the fabric in this discharge printing method. We have a couple of other printing methods that we can look at above in this particular slide. We have a burnout printing method, which tends to be ideal for shears. We have an example of this on number 65 in our book, which is the page that you should be on right now. And it's not really a method where you're actually burning things with a flame. It was done that way traditionally, but today an acid can be placed on the fabric to eat away the areas that would have been burned away. Acid burns away fabrics on certain types of fabrics. You kind of have to know what fabrics you're working with before you apply the acid to burn away certain portions of it. So you see that on number 65. We won't talk too much about flocked prints or voided velvets, but on the voided velvets, it's also an acid technique to remove sections of the pile yarns, exposing the ground fabric that is behind it. We've talked about batiks before, which are hand-printed fabrics that are very unique. They don't have a repeat to them. And these come under the category of resist dyeing and printing. This is where areas of a design are treated with a substance, the resist substance, a wax or a paste that prevents the dye from being absorbed. And then the wax or the paste is removed or washed away or melted away after the fabric has been dyed. So it's a complicated process. These images show that some beautiful fabrics can be created this before with just using some sort of a resist material like a wax or a paste to prevent the fabric from being dyed. So the left top image is a batik that just characterized by fine streaks and kind of a crackle effect. And the left bottom image shows kind of a commercially simulated resist image that wasn't actually done as a resist dyeing method. It was just printed to kind of create that look. I don't think we have any samples to look for on this slide for the resist dyeing method. So other techniques or other fabrics can be produced using this similar kind of a technique. And I think it's best understood if you've ever done tie-dyeing, which is so much fun. Early on in COVID, my daughter bought some tie-dyeing kits, and we spent a day in the garage tie-dyeing all kinds of fabrics for t-shirts and hats and fabric for quilts by just tying off with rubber bands certain portions of the fabric. So that rubber band, that area that's clamped in the rubber band, when the fabric goes in the dye, that tightly clamped area does not absorb the dye. And you've seen that if you've done tie-dyeing. It's a really fun method of resist dyeing. So this shows a couple of other more sophisticated patterns that can be be created with clamping off. This one on the left is a clamp resist method. Use carved wood panels clamped together as the resist device, giving us this beautiful pattern. The one on the right is shibori, which is an ancient Japanese method where they're tying off areas with string in a very complicated way to create these beautiful images that look like they're probably bats on a black and blue ground fabric. So different dye resist methods that give us beautiful, beautiful fabrics. Other resist dyes would be called warp dye resist, where the warp threads are tied together and then dyed so that the tied areas do not accept dyes. And we talked a few minutes ago about ikat, which is the one on the top left, where the threads are actually warp resist dyed before they are woven into the fabric. So portions of it are tied off so that they don't accept the dye. In this case, it's just 2 or 3 different colors. And then it shows really well on the one on the bottom right is an ikat, where these threads are actually dyed individually before they are woven into the fabric. Kind of a complicated process, but gives an interesting looking fabric in the final result. Look around your rooms again and see if you can find samples of some of these printing methods that we have just talked about. Let's review that just a bit on one slide, the differences between dyeing and printing. But before we do that, I found we talked about color at the beginning of class, and I found a page in, well, actually I've seen this several times in interior design magazines. It's actually an ad for Sherwin-Williams, but right down this website, they have a little quiz that you can go through to find your color ID that kind of helps you decide on colors that might be in palettes that you would choose just by answering a series of questions. And I found it kind of a fun exercise to do. So take the quiz to find your color ID at this website. So write this down. This is myswcolorid.com. So the SWW is, of course, it's an ad for Sherwin-Williams. So let me spell that for you. It is myswcolorid.com. myswcolorid.com. So write that down, and this week go through that exercise to kind of come up with what your personal palette is, according to Sherwin-Williams. It was kind of fun, and shoot me an email and let me know what your personal palette is, and tell me if that this little exercise matches up with what gives you colors that are expected, or if it showed you colors that you had never even considered using, and whether or not you like the conclusions on this little quiz. Kind of fun. An exercise that's not going to be graded, but still I'd like you to send me an email if you get a chance and tell me what you came up with on that. Okay, so let's review dyeing. Dyeing is done where either the fabric, the finished fabric, the individual yarns, or the beginning fibers are immersed with and saturated with a solution that completely colors that particular material, which is either fabric, yarn, or fiber. So that is the dyeing process. The printing process occurs after the fabric is done to a basic, or what's called a greige, G-R-E-I-G-E, just a basic fabric, where coloring agents are applied to specific areas of the surface to create patterns or motifs. Okay? That's kind of what happens with the printing method, the difference between dyeing and printing. So hopefully you've looked around the room where you're sitting right now, or in your bedroom when you get home later, and you can kind of recognize the difference between dyeing methods and printing methods. Okay? Okay, so now with the information that you have, you can go ahead and identify and label and the dye and print information in your swatch kit. That will be due this week. You can find more information on that under Helpful Files in this week's module. And then you will let me know that you have done that by uploading a few of the pages onto Canvas, and then I can grade and give you the points for this assignment. So that's the only assignment for this week, to update your swatch kit with the dye and print method for each of those 84 fabrics. And I believe that is all for now. I apologize for not having a couple of the videos uploaded for you to watch, but I think I covered thoroughly all the information that I had for you on those videos. So let's wrap up this lecture. I think that's all I have to say on printing and dyeing. And good luck on putting the information in your swatch book this week for lesson number 9. And I will see you next time for week number 10. Goodbye.